Welcome to the first official episode of the Emerging Leader podcast. I'm Ashley Linkowich. Thank you so much for tuning into this first episode. It's going to be one that I've actually never shared this entire story before. And this is all about my journey to Australia from $15 to where I am currently, and basically all of the highs and lows along that journey. I really hope that throughout this episode, you can relate to yourself in my story and also take away some of my biggest learnings that I had from moving here with basically nothing. I'm really sharing this story to hopefully inspire your own success. And I'm sure that you'll see yourself in parts of my story as well. And it's definitely not always glamorous. And I think that's what people often see when they see living on the northern beaches, living in Sydney, and they don't actually see all of the backstory that happened and how I actually made it to Australia and all of the drama that came with that. I really hope that you enjoy this episode. It's going to be interesting. The Emerging Leader Podcast. So my journey to Australia basically started in 2017 when I graduated from industrial engineering in a very small city in Canada. And granted, the people that I went to university with wouldn't say it's a small city because many of them grew up in towns of 300 people, 2,000 people. I grew up in a town of about 20,000, which could have been considered the big smoke for them. But we went to university in a small town in Saskatchewan, which had about 200,000 people. Very small university, about 10,000 students. It was freezing. This school was in the middle of the prairies. It's completely just flat. The old joke is that you can watch your dog run away for 4 days. It's so flat. And because of that, it's so windy. In the winter, it's basically minus 40, not all the time, but a lot of the time it's minus 40. The whole university is connected by hallways that are underground or above ground because you just can't go outside for most of the year. And so once I graduated in 2017, almost all of the people I graduated with were working in either agriculture or steel because there was a big steel manufacturing plant in the area and obviously tons of farms. And I just sat down one night, I was drinking beers, probably had too many beers. I was just like, you know what, I just need to get out of here. I cannot stay here. I didn't want to go back to Alberta where my family was and where I grew up. I just felt like I needed something different. So grabbed another beer and quite literally Googled engineering visas. That was it. People expect this big grand plan of, I've been thinking about it for ages. No, it was just beers and a Google search, engineering visas. At the top of the search query, well done Australia on your SEO, was a 476 visa, which for those that know, it's a graduate visa. So basically, if you've graduated from a program that's on the skills list, you can apply for an 18-month visa. So that night I applied for the visa. And then in January of 2018, so only a few months later, I landed in Australia. Now, part of this was I just assumed that I'm an industrial engineering graduate, hot commodity, right? There's no way that I'm not going to get a job in engineering. There's just no way. And granted, I did apply for almost 200 jobs before I landed in Australia. And I only got one callback. One single callback out of 200, not great odds. But because of that, I actually had some hope. I was like, look, it's because I'm in Canada. I haven't actually landed in Australia. Plus I was applying for jobs all over the country because I didn't actually know where I was going to move. I hadn't really booked my flights or anything. But once I got this one callback and it was from Southeast Water in Melbourne, a massive water company, I thought, oh my God, this is it. Of course, I'm going to get this job. There's no way that I can't get this job. So I decided to move to Melbourne. And for those that have lived in Melbourne, you'll know that I didn't just move anywhere in Melbourne. I moved to Frankston, which is on the southeast side, often known as kind of like a hood area, although it's getting a lot better, guys. It's getting a lot better. And personally, I really like Frankston. Anyway, so I moved there because that's where Southeast Water's offices were. So ultimately, I had passed the phone screen. So there were apparently 300 applicants that applied. Then there was the phone screen, and then they made it down to a final 12. So there were 12 of us in the final stage of the interview, and there were 3 positions. So I thought, oh, honestly, like the odds are really good that I'm actually going to get this job. So I went down to Frankston, and that's where I stayed to do my next round of interviews, which were in person. And that's where they put us through all sorts of different kind of like logic puzzles and different kind of graduate engineering sort of challenges, I guess. I was so confident that I was going to get this job that I started applying for apartments in the area. And granted, like I did not have much money. I'd spent most of my money on the Airbnb. And now I was applying for apartments, which was crazy to me. What do you mean I need one? Like the cost is insane. My apartment in Saskatchewan was $400 a month, and now I'm paying that weekly. That's crazy. But then also to have to sign up to this crazy bond to give them so much of my personal information, it was just completely bizarre to me. I applied for this apartment, and the real estate agent, property manager says, look, I need a contract from your employer to actually secure this apartment for you. From there I said, well, look, like it's only a few days away because I'm for sure going to get this job. Like I'm just waiting for them to finalize the contracts and send it through to me. And she was like, look, we can't give you the apartment until you send us that contract, so just stay tuned. From there, I get a call back about 30 minutes later, and she says, look, I've actually spoken to the landlord, and he's happy for you to just send the contract when you get it, but congratulations, the apartment is yours. And I am stoked. I'm like so happy, right? I've just gotten this apartment. I've just sent her the bond money, which is like more money than I've ever had. And that was kind of the last of the money ultimately, was the first month's rent and the bond for the apartment. I was down to so little money that I had to decide between buying a mattress or buying a fridge. There was like not enough for both. So I ended up buying a mattress, which I put on the floor, and then borrowed a mini fridge from the lady that I'd been sharing an Airbnb with. A mattress on the floor and a mini fridge. That was the extent of the apartment. So I'm waiting to hear back from this job about whether I actually did get the role. And I remember very, very vividly, I'm at the gym training and I get a call from them. And worst phone call ever so far. Ash, you did not get the role. I'm like, are you serious? I've just moved here. I have spent all of my money on this apartment. I have really put all of my eggs in this one basket for this job. And now you're telling me that I didn't get it. Like, what am I supposed to do? I was honestly just in shock at that point. And I vividly remember as well calling my dad afterwards. And I said, like, what do I do? Like, this is crazy. I basically have $15 left after buying this mattress for the apartment. What am I actually supposed to do here? And that's when he reminded me of himself when he graduated from engineering as well. And he basically just went door to door, downtown Calgary, going to different oil companies until he got his first job. And I remember very, very specifically what he said to me in that moment. He said, Ash, you just need to create something out of nothing. I was just like, God damn, like, how am I going to do that? I literally have $15. And I've just been rejected from my only job prospect. Not off to a good start. And so basically, after that moment, I knew that I would have to get completely responsible and create something out of nothing. So I went to Officeworks, which is this kind of print and copy place, and printed off all of my resumes and also bought a bus pass. That's what I spent my last $15 on. Bunch of resumes and a bus pass. And get this, the resumes weren't even formatted properly because the borders in Canada on Word documents are completely different to Australia, but I couldn't reprint them. So I just had to accept that the borders were pretty weird, but we would just have to go from there. And this is that book. This is the book of all of my resumes printed out. And this was my last $15 From there, I basically just started Googling. I made a complete list of all of the engineering companies in this industrial area that I was familiar with, close enough to where I lived. And I just started listing them out. What are they? Where are they located? What do they focus on? I actually have that list here. Manufacturing and engineering companies. And this was all over Dandenong, all over different areas within that kind of Southeast Melbourne industrial park. And on day one, I basically took the bus to the industrial area and walked around door to door. And I am shaking. I'm so scared. I've never had to do this before in my entire life. Just introducing myself. Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm an engineering graduate. I've just moved here from Canada, like kind of looking for a job. Do you have anything? And all of them said no. They were all so nice, right? They were like, wow, like super shocked to see you in this industrial area. It doesn't even have sidewalks. I'm walking on the grass. When there are these big trucks driving by me, I'm completely out of place. But they were all super kind and they said, look, really admire what you're doing. Here's my business card, or here's another place I think you should check out, and good luck. And you can see that in the front of this book is all of these different business cards that I got from people and lists of places that they suggested that I actually go to. On day two, the lady that I had shared the Airbnb with, Heather, was saying to me, look, Ash, like, let me help you. So she actually took the day off work, I think, so that instead of me having to walk around door to door, she would actually drive me door to door. So a much, much better situation for me, and definitely for my legs and just my entire outlook on the situation. So did another few hours of just going door to door, luckily much easier with her in her car, and we were able to really reach a bunch of different places. To this day, Heather is like my Australian mom. Like, she is just absolutely incredible and has been like one of my biggest supporters here in Oz. So on the second day, complete rejection, again, complete rejection, until I got to the last place. So the last place I went was a small fabricator run by a guy named Peter. And he basically said, he's like, look, I don't have a job for you, but I'm the president for the Southeast Melbourne Manufacturing Alliance, I think it's called. And if you send me your resume, I'll put it on the website and we'll send an email out to our members. And to me, that was like the best lead I had had so far. I was just like, honestly, oh my God, like that is incredible. So I took him up on that, and then I just called it a day because I was like, look, that's probably the best I'm going to do at this point. So a couple days later, I actually get an email from Peter, maybe it was a phone call, I don't know, saying, hey, I know I said I don't actually have any roles for you at the moment, but I think I could actually use an engineer to run my factory and run the team and optimize orders, read drawings, that sort of thing. And so he called me in for an interview, and I was super scared because he pulls out all of these like crazy plans for this massive steel structure pool roof that they were fabricating for someone. And he's like, yeah, so your job is basically to read all these drawings, take off all the material, make sure that we have everything in stock. So you're doing the procurement of all of the materials. You're managing the team of 15 staff outside, making sure that they're working on the right things, coordinating with me so that I can focus more on like the sales and marketing aspect of the business. I was like, God, like that's a lot and very scary. So I was completely scared, but I'm like, sweet, yeah, no worries. Have total experience in this. Anyways, the next day I get a call from Peter saying that, yep, he's happy for me to take the job. And honestly, that was just one of the most relieving moments of my life, was hearing that he had believed in me and he'd given me a job, and that it was also the last place that I went on my 2 days of going door to door. And with Heather's help, we managed to make it work. Absolutely incredible. And to this day, Peter and I are, I'd say, like quite close as well. And he has done more than he will ever know for my journey in Australia. From there, 6 months later, I actually got another call saying, hey, you dropped off your resume here 6 months ago. Do you want to come in for an interview? And this was for like a maintenance manager style role at a big steel foundry that was doing like aerospace and automotive parts. I went in and I said to them, look, like they offered me this maintenance role. And I said, look, that's probably not really my thing. I'm not actually very good with machines. I'm sure I could learn it, but I'm not super good with that. And I rejected the role. But then I saw they had another leadership role. I think it was a supervisor role for a large part of their factory. And so I actually called them back and I said, look, I know I rejected you for the role you offered me last week, but make me a new offer for this one. And surprisingly, I don't know if they just thought, who is this chick? Why is she doing this? But they offered me the role and I was there for another 18 months. Throughout those first two roles, I was thrown in the deep end multiple times. I was leading very, very complex teams. So in the first group, it was a team of about 15 that I was leading with Peter. And the hard part was that I was 22 at the time. And all of these guys are much older than me. They have been in the industry for longer than I've been alive. And that was the same at the next company as well. A lot of my staff, and I was leading a team of, I think, 23 at that time, they had also been at that specific company for longer than I'd been alive. And the pressure that comes with that and just being thrown in the deep end and just having to figure it out was really, really tough. But it's just something that you just get better at with time. And you're never fully prepared for a role like that. But ultimately, I just had to jump in, just had to do it. And throughout those first two roles, I made a ton of mistakes. Whether that was in the first role and I'd screw up customers' orders or like the sequence of work and they'd be upset like, well, why isn't this work done yet? What's going on? And actually customers like threatening to come to the factory. And I was learning in the deep end as it was happening. And that was the same in the second place as well. Learning a whole new process, all sorts of complex things, really big on quality, because obviously with aerospace and automotive, it's super high quality standards. And so to learn all of that process as well was really, really challenging. During my time at the second company, my dad was diagnosed with bone cancer after he had previously successfully beat bladder cancer. And this was super horrific to me. And I was just really torn between, do I go back to Canada? Do I stay here? What do I do about my visa? This company was supposed to sponsor me to stay longer. And I just thought, geez. And when speaking to him, he was very adamant that I was to stay in Australia. Ultimately, after my dad's diagnosis and even prior to, I was really struggling with my relationship with my manager at the time. We had super different ideas about the way that things should be run. And because of that, I just decided to leave. I figured, you know what, I'm not in Australia to feel this way, and I'm not like necessarily advocating for that, but I do think that you need to stand up for how you feel in these roles and really do what's best for you. Probably not necessarily taking the nuclear route like I did, which was quitting with only 3 months left on your visa and then not having any other options, but you have to do what's best for you in these scenarios. So during my time at the second job, I became super interested in like data and analytics, especially applied to manufacturing. I'd done quite a bit of work for them in that space. And so I just started looking up jobs. And that's when I found a role with Infobuild, my current company, which was actually a 3-month contract position for an engineering kind of operational analytical person to really automate and streamline a lot of their reporting. So that's what I applied for. And luckily I got that role, which I thought this was perfect because the government has deemed me too young and too inexperienced to actually qualify for another visa. So this is great because it's a 3-month contract and then I'll just end up going back to Canada and go from there. So this happened in February 2020 and all of us know what happened next. So 1 month later, COVID struck, Melbourne went into super strict lockdown. And I remember meeting with my immigration advisor and lawyer, and she said, look, there is a new COVID visa that will extend your visa for 3 months because ultimately no flights were leaving Australia. They completely shut it down. And she said, look, no one I know has ever had this accepted yet because it's so new, but let's just try and see how it goes. So we applied for that, and luckily enough, I was granted this visa and I was able to extend my visa for 3 more months. Now, during this time, anyone that's familiar with the Australian point system for immigration knows that it's completely bizarre. And during this 3 months, I magically became old enough and experienced enough to qualify to be sponsored. You wouldn't even believe it. It's just crazy. They couldn't deport me. And then suddenly I qualify for another visa. So luckily through this process, InfraBuild was an incredible sponsor to me. They sponsored a lot of my work and ultimately wanted me to keep going with the company and sponsored me. But through this process, I was basically acting like I had nothing to lose. So in my work, I was super interested in automation, developing applications, building relationships with as many people as I could, just like learning as I went and just applying everything I knew. I was not worried about politics or rules or anything. I was just like, look, I only have 3 months here, so I'm just gonna give it as much as I have. I literally have nothing to lose and just go from there. And that proved to be an incredible strategy to get my work noticed by people above me that actually had the power to sponsor me and keep me in the country. And this is something that I do to this day, probably to my detriment sometimes. I'm just right into it. What can I actually do to make these things happen? And not really worrying about what's happened in the past, or sometimes I'm skipping process. Not great, but sometimes you just have to give it everything you have. What if you only had 3 more months in this role? How would you actually react? What would you do? And just start acting on it. So once I was sponsored, I was promoted into a national role, which was incredible because as soon as the borders opened, literally the weekend the borders opened between Victoria and New South Wales, which is where Melbourne and Sydney are, I put everything I owned into my Volkswagen Golf that was barely hanging on, like it was literally falling apart, had no air conditioning, completely fallen apart, and put everything I owned into the Golf, and I just drove. And I drove from Melbourne to Sydney the next day. I was actually supposed to go to Brisbane, but I was staying in Sydney for 2 weeks because my boss was based in Sydney, and I spent a bit of time there. Where things kind of changed for me was actually when I was in Sydney. That's where I met my partner, Joe, who, for those that know, he's also Canadian engineer, has lived in Sydney for almost the same time as I've been in Australia, grew up on opposite sides of Canada, and so met Joe in Sydney and then basically decided, oh, screw it, I'm not going to Brisbane, I'm going to stay here with Joe, and now here we are. So I never actually made it to Brisbane. I have, of course, been to Brisbane so many times for work, but yes, funnily enough, I never actually made it out of Sydney. So from there, I've been in multiple different roles. Now I'm in this national detailing 3D modeling role where I'm leading a team of between 50 and 60 engineers and architects. So basically we're translating all of the engineering drawings from our clients with tier 1 construction. So bridges, high rises, tunnels, into reinforcing that needs to be supplied on site. Super focused on our digital offer, 3D modeling. How do we digitize more of what we're doing, especially in such a legacy industry like steel, where it's something that's absolutely essential to life. And of course, we're looking at all of the green steel options that we have moving forward and low carbon options for steel. But ultimately, it's an incredible role, and I'm very, very lucky to have such a great team and to have been supported by InfraBuild through this journey over the last almost 5 years with them. Honestly, such a crazy story to have come here, put all of my eggs in one basket with a role down in Southeast Water. And it's so funny, right? Because when I got that call, you just feel like this is the worst thing that could happen to me. This is awful. How am I ever going to recover from this? But then to look back and to say, you can just see how everything is happening for a reason. And COVID was awful. It was awful in Melbourne. But that being said, if COVID wouldn't have happened, I would have already left Australia and I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have met Joe. So everything has just kind of lined up. Some of the key lessons that I've learned throughout this process. The main one is about creating something out of nothing and really getting responsible for your outcome. You see so many people that are just kind of like leaves in the wind. Wherever the wind blows them, that's kind of what they're going, or they're just like, oh, I wish these things would just happen for me. But ultimately, that's just not life. You need to get responsible for your outcome. What can you do to make something happen, to create something out of nothing? Whether that's building relationships, whether it's like cold emailing people, whether it's knocking on doors to try and get your first job. This is something that was my biggest lesson throughout my entire 7 years in Australia, and something that I use all the time in my own life. Even with this podcast, it's like, it makes me so nervous to do this. I feel terrified, honestly, but I just have to be responsible for creating something that I would have wanted. And that's what I'm trying to do here. A great quote from Alex Hormozi is something along the lines of that it's not money you need in retirement, it's skills, or skills are your retirement. Because while you can lose money, you can lose jobs, you can lose all sorts of things, you'll never lose the skills that you gained in that process. And that's definitely what I've seen over the last 7 years. Another key lesson I learned was that rejection is absolutely inevitable, but it's also a key skill. This was something I was absolutely not used to before I moved to Australia and went door to door looking for jobs. I had never actually been rejected from a job interview ever at that point until I got that phone call. I'd always been successful, and then going door to door and knowing that the chance of you getting rejected is so much higher than success. It was actually just becoming more used to rejection made it easier for me to actually get out there and ask for things that I wanted. This is something that I talk to my staff about, and something else I use all the time is that everything I want is on the other side of a hard conversation. And whether that's a hard question or, hey, I want a salary increase, hey, I want to change jobs, I'm not satisfied in my relationship, whatever it is, everything you want is on the other side of that hard conversation. Your personal brand is so important. If I hadn't made an impression at InfoBuild and built relationships with a bunch of people as much as I could at that point, and also taken responsibility to actually do that and really self-promote my work, I probably wouldn't be here either, because they wouldn't even know who I was. My contract would expire, my visa would expire, and they wouldn't know any different. So you absolutely need to promote your work and promote yourself and build authentic relationships with people. I'm not saying to just constantly ask, but it's incredible what relationships you can build when you just ask people how they're doing and actually pay attention to how they're feeling and try and actually get to know them and understand their story a bit more. The other thing is that the only true failure is giving up. Cheesy, so cheesy. But even with the podcast, I feel like the only true failure here is if I completely stop doing it. And that was the same with my whole journey in Australia. If I was to quit, if I was to call my parents and say, book me a ticket, go back home, I feel like that was the only way I could truly fail in this situation. And finally, always stay true to your values, and things will absolutely work out for you in the long term. So, I've experienced jobs where I really love the job. I've experienced jobs where I'm like, look, job is okay, but really struggling with the values here. And there's obviously a clear conflict. And just making the call to support yourself and support your own values, that will always pay off. And there will be other opportunities that open up because you've stayed true to your values. So I think it's super critical to always chase that and make sure that you're doing things that actually align with your values. And we'll talk about that more in another episode. So ultimately, what now? So now, I'm a permanent resident. I've applied for citizenship. The final boss of Australian immigration is almost here. I'm just really focused on the role that I have, and as well about how do I continue to apply digital and digitize legacy industries. So that's something I'm super passionate about at the moment. I'm always super focused on learning more, whether that's about managing business, entrepreneurship, product management, project management, all sorts of things. So that's also a big focus of mine. And obviously now my big focus is also the podcast. So ultimately, without these experiences, I definitely would not have the confidence I have now. And granted, it's not perfect, to make tough decisions and to flow through life and make sure that I'm lined up with my values, I'm doing the things I want to do, but also to be scared and do it anyways, as I'm trying to navigate by putting myself out here again on another podcast. But even harder because it's in video form. So, like I said, despite this whole crazy experience, I still have the imposter syndrome. I still have crazy anxiety sometimes, and I'm working on that. And I'm not sure that I'll actually truly ever get over them. But ultimately, again, like I said, it's about being scared and do it anyways. I would love to hear what's resonated with you in this story. I hope that you've really enjoyed or seen part of yourself through this story and have some really key takeaways as well. It's interesting sharing this story for the first time because I think people just assume that moving to Australia, I had a job, I was sponsored to come here from Canada. And in reality, that was not the case at all. And there have been some incredible highs and some devastating lows over the last 7 years here in Australia. But that being said, I hope you've loved this episode. Would love to hear your comments and your questions. You can email me, you can reach out on social media or through any of the channels. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that are listening to the podcast.